Okay, we'll get started. Today's April 14th, day before tax day, 2014, the special meeting of the Board of Education District 64. We will be doing several things tonight. We'll be going into a closed session early, coming out of that, going into a public hearing, and then going into our special meeting, which is to have a review for the board purposes, educational purposes, on student services, particularly special needs, things like that, which actually is going to be very, very interesting. I'm looking forward to this, Jim, too, with a great deal of interest. So let's start out by doing a roll call. Terry?
Dan Collins.
Here.
David Paterno.
Here.
Scott Zimmerman.
Here.
Tony Burrell.
Here.
John Heidi.
Here.
And Vicki Lee.
Here.
Terry Cameron's here.
And Terry's here too. As I said, we'll go into closed session. We have several items to talk about in closed session. And according to Illinois Compiled Statutes 122C1, performance-specific employees, collective negotiating matters on 5 Illinois Compiled Statutes 122C2, and pending or potential litigation, 5 Illinois Compiled Statutes 122C11. We will need to, I'll make the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
And we'll need a roll call.
Here.
Dan.
Here.
Yes? Dathan?
What are we doing now?
A roll call to go into closed session.
Oh, aye. Aye.
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
Great. Taking our few minutes break, and we're going to reconvene our meeting now into our open session. We will accept public comments, as we do for all open meetings, and then at that point we'll go into a public hearing, come out of public hearing, and begin our long-anticipated special meeting. So first part of my process is to ask if there's any public comments for the open meeting. Going once, going twice? No public comments. Okay, great. We will now open up our public hearing on the proposed honorable dismissals of teachers for economic necessity. Joel? You're going to make some comments on the public hearing?
These are never easy because you're talking about individuals and the effects that the decisions are going to have. However, they are a necessity. We will be looking at, or before you tonight, is a number of reductions in force due to enrollment that has been discussed previously, along with the before and after school based on the decision made with the Park District. We will be looking at our teacher assistants and moving employees to match up with the teacher contracts or contractual work year. And those are the paperwork that you have in front of you regarding the riffing that we have for tonight.
Now, in any public hearing, there always has to be a section for public comments for a public hearing. So again, I ask anybody in the audience if they would like to make a public comment for this particular public hearing. And not seeing any, again, going once, going twice, no public comments on the public hearing. If there are no public comments, I go to the board. If there are any board comments on the public hearing. And not hearing or seeing any motion to make a public comment from the board aspect of it, I would close the public hearing for honorable dismissal of teachers for economic necessity. The next item on our agenda is consent agenda. And I'd ask anybody to make a motion.
I'll make a motion for the bulk of the consent agenda. I move that the Board of Education of Community Consolidated School District 64, Park Ridge-Niles, Illinois, approve the consent agenda of April 14, 2014, which includes the personnel report, including Resolution number 1115, non-reemployment of part-time educational support personnel employees. Resolution number 1117, honorable dismissal of teachers. Resolution number 1119, reduction in position of full-time educational support personnel employees. Resolution number 1120, dismissal of probationary educational support personnel employees. Bills and approval of intergovernmental agreement for shared vision O&M services. And that obviously saves one resolution for later.
We'll need a second on that.
Second.
Thank you. And starting on Vicky's side?
Aye.
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 Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. John, there was one thing that was omitted in that consent agenda. Would anybody want to make a motion to bring that back?
I can make a motion regarding that as well. I move that the Board of Education of Community Consolidated School District 64, Park Ridge-Niles, Illinois, approve resolution number 1118 with the exception that William Connor is deleted from the list of teachers to be dismissed.
Second.
We'll take a vote on that starting on Dan's side. Aye.
Nay. Nay.
Nay.
Aye.
Aye.
Nay.
4-3.
So somebody then needs to make a motion similar to the one that I did, but just straight for resolution number 1118.
I move that the Board of Education of Community Consolidated School District 64, Park Ridge-Niles, Illinois, approve resolution number 1118, honorable dismissal and reduction of teachers.
Is there a second?
Second.
Starting on Vicky's side?
Aye.
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 Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. We have completed the open items, consent agenda items, and we are now moving into the main reason we are gathered here tonight. The board has asked the Director of Special Services, Jim Even, to speak to us tonight regarding special education. Though I've spent 3 years on the board, I can tell you that my level of knowledge on the intricacies of special education certainly are not overwhelming. So, Jim, I'm looking forward to this. And welcome.
Thank you. It's warming up here. Can you hear me? We'll get the screen
Sure
warmed up
can.
in just
Go
a
ahead.
moment. This originally was going to be a committee of the whole cow, and it got changed last week to a discussion, so I did downsize it quite a bit, which may not be a problem, but I'm sure we could fill it in with questions. So what I chose to do is just give you some of the kind of special ed 101, some of the overriding laws that we are under with regard to delivering special education services, and then also some of the board policy and how it's manifested from federal law to state law to board policy. So, is that should be clearer, or is that?
Yeah, it's
Oh, you got it. Okay.
that doesn't work for me.
There you go.
I'm just kidding.
Okay, the legal framework for. Thank you, Mr. Collins. The legal framework is that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, IDEA, is kind of the overriding federal law that requires. It used to be, and that was really started in about 1973, and there was education for all children with disabilities prior to that. So that's kind of the overriding law for federal mandates for special ed services within the schools. And then Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, is really more of a facilities and workplace issue Act. So, for example, if somebody wanted to come attend a board meeting and they had a physical disability, the ADA would be the federal law that would be under, that would be the relevant law. Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973, that original law in 1973, interesting enough, was made for the benefit of returning Vietnam vets who had been wounded or were struggling with physical or mental issues, and that was to reduce the level of discrimination or try to give them a level playing field when they returned to the United States for employment in school, etc. And since then, the Section 504, which is just one component of the Rehab Act, has kind of taken on a life of its own, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then there are Illinois laws, rules, and regs. Article 14 of the school code mandates all the special education rules. Part 226 rules and regs, that is the state's interpretation of IDEA. So the federal government says, here's a broad framework for the laws, and then each state has certain rules and regs that they have some flexibility with. So for example, the federal government may say that all children with IEPs, once they have attained the age of 16, have to have a transition plan. And the transition plan is what their adult outcomes are and what the school is going to do to support them in employment, education, independent living, and community access. Federal says 16, but the state of Illinois has said 14 and a half. So the states can make some changes within keeping with the overall federal mandate. The school code has food allergy guidelines and also the Care of Students with Diabetes Act. Those are all part of the legal frameworks how we operate under in special education. Anytime you have questions, please feel free to ask. Our board policy 6120 basically says that the school district shall provide a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment and necessary related services to all children with disabilities enrolled in the district as required by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and implementing provisions of the School Code 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. The term children with disabilities as used in this policy means children between the ages of 3 and 21, inclusive, for whom it is determined through definitions and procedures described in the ISB special ed rules that special education services are needed. So this is the board policy, and in our policy procedures is spelled correctly. It is not up here, I apologize. And so what we have to do is we have board policy, and then we have to come up with administrative procedures. So we have administrative procedures for all of the different aspects of 504, of IDEA, and all the other aspects of this. And so that's the connection between federal, state 226 rules and regs, and then board policy 6120. There are other aspects of board policy that talk about special education with regard to discipline, access to extracurricular activities, homebound services, home hospital, etc. And just as a aside, IDEA for special education, we probably have around 700 children in our district out of 4,300, so we're probably around 14% of our students enrolled have an IEP. We probably have another 200 children that have a 504 plan. And a 504 plan is a federal part of the Rehab Act. And generally, so for a child with diabetes, a child with leukemia, a child who may have a temporary medical or physical issue that requires an accommodation may have a 504 plan. In the past, there are 14 categories of disability that IDEA recognizes, and a group of parents have often wanted ADHD to be recognized as a disability. The federal government chose not to do that. What they did is they wrote a letter saying it can be considered under IDEA under the disability of other health impaired, and I'll talk about that a little bit more a little bit later. And so we probably have, if you walk in our schools, probably 1 out of 5 children have some type of legal oversight, an IEP, a 504 for whatever reason. And so people generally don't always realize that. Now, many of those kids, it might be speech only, but 1 out of 5 do have at least something.
Jim, how does that compare to other districts?
Pardon?
How does that compare to other districts?
Our level of percent of students with disabilities as compared to the total enrollment is probably about 1.5% higher than the state average for similar districts. I must say, though, that I think about 5-6 years ago, we were at 20%.
20?
20. And starting with, Kathy Nelson, who I think, who did a great job, my predecessor, the numbers have been coming down because with RTI, we're a little bit more, there's more of a process where it's a response to intervention versus, testing that would make the discrepancy model make a lot of kids eligible for services and they otherwise wouldn't. So the philosophy nowadays is try to give kids what they need to prevent them from being labeled special education, but if they do need it, of course, we're going to do it. So our numbers are rather close, and generally you find in some, the more affluent areas of a lot of parents advocate for their kids, et cetera, and so the percentage of Park Ridge is not really that unusual. The administrative procedures, and some of you may not realize, but we were part of a co-op, MedSep, and it was with 62, 63, 64, and 207, and it dissolved a year ago. And we went to the state board, they approved the dissolution, and so last year was our first year of being a standalone district. And so we had to come up with our own administrative procedures and submit them to the state, which we did, and they were approved. And in those procedures, we have to cover these main areas, and I'll just read them. I know you can read them yourself, but I'll go through them. FAPE, which is free appropriate public education, a viable organization and financial structure. So I had to show the state what our organizational structure was, prepare and send financial information. Systematic procedures for identifying and evaluating the need for special ed and related services, qualified personnel, appropriate and adequate facilities, functional relationships with public and private agencies, interaction with parents and other concerned persons, procedures for internal evaluation of services, and continuous planning for program growth and improvement. So we have procedures for all of these different aspects of special education in the district, and I'll just go through some of the highlights with you. With regard to FAPE, legal term, a lot of the attorneys use that all the time. You're denying my child FAPE, or I want FAPE. FAPE is free appropriate public education, and it's a continuum of appropriate alternative placements available to meet the needs of children for special education and related services, which may include but is not limited to any of the following. Gen Ed classes, all students are Gen Ed students first. And that's generally what IDEA says, and that's what the rules and regs say, and that's what we generally say as a philosophy, that every child is a Gen Ed student first. So that's the default position. So when a child has a disability, the Gen Ed class is always where we want to try to deliver those services. Some of those children may need special ed support. So some of those kids who get speech only, they may be pulled out 2 20-minute sessions a week, 1 40-minute, and they go to speech. They may get push-in services, they may be in a small group. So that's probably the least restrictive type of service where they get a minimal amount of service. Some kids have a learning disability or health impairment or an emotional disability. They may need special education classes. Generally, when a child is pulled out of general ed for more than 50% of the day, they get instructional services. If they're pulled out for less than 50% of the day, they're a resource student. So we try to look at the continuum of those. I know in the past we've had the term special needs, STRIVE, all of those, but those were programs. And they were really, a lot of times we drove things by what the program needs were versus what the individual child needs were. So we've eliminated some of those program names and just say, here's what each child needs, and we label it as the state requires. If it's more than 50%, it's resource. If it's instructional, if it's less, it's resource. We do have, so in our schools, every building does have instructional level services and others have resource. Now resource tends to be supplemental, where they'll have core, language arts and math, and they may get supplemental instruction where it's supplemented and they get extra support or an intervention. And we try not to replace core curriculum. For some kids, they need a replacement curriculum. If you've got a kid in 5th grade who is reading at a 2nd grade level, they may need core plus, or they may need replacement. We generally don't like to replace core, but sometimes the discrepancy is so great that we need to do that. Special schools. We have around 28 children in the district that are out of district. They're in public or private facilities. Public is going to be if we have a student in Chippewa or Cumberland in Des Plaines, where we've had children there for a number of years, and we pay tuition to 62 for that. We've got some kids at NSSEO and SSED where they have special programs, and we pay tuition for that. Those are public day. Private day is going to be your facilities like the Janine Schultz, Camelot, Metro Prep, Laureate Day, other types of facilities where they are private, generally for-profit or connected to a non-for-profit, but they're private. They're licensed by the state, and they are able to charge a certain day rate, which we pay, and then we would be eligible for some partial reimbursement. So the kids who are out of the district are public and private day. Many districts also have kids who are in private day, and they're also in a residential facility, and so the district would then also pay room and board. We pay the residential fee for those kids. And they might be in Wisconsin, downstate Illinois, Utah. There's a lot of residential facilities. At this time, we have no one in residential in Park Ridge, but typically districts often do. Yes, sir.
You said we have 28 kids out of district. Does that include public and private?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jim?
Yes.
I had heard at one time that each school had maybe the area with expertise. How does it work now? Is every kid at their home school?
What we did, and thank you, Mrs. Lee, what we had in the past was that Carpenter and Franklin were known as the schools that had special needs programs. So they had a primary program or a kindergarten program, a primary program, 1, 2, and then 3 could be primary, and then 4 or 5 would be intermediate. So what that meant is that when I came here, there was a lot of issue about when kids left Jefferson from our early childhood program, and they needed to have replacement curriculum or a smaller instructional type of program. If their home school was field, they would have to go to Carpenter and Franklin, and that was very difficult for a lot of families. They started a program for kindergarten. They would get full-day kindergarten, so we had a program where we were sending kids half-day to their home school, and then they were bused to Carpenter and Franklin, the rest of the second part of the school, and that was very difficult for families. So a pilot was started by Kathy Nelson her last year here, which was at Roosevelt, where we said, well, let's just create a program there. We did not increase staff. We did not increase any of the resources needed. We just transferred staff from Carpenter or Franklin. It was very successful. We followed the change protocol within the contractual obligations we have, and we found that the Roosevelt parents community were thrilled. We had a lot of comments that parents were really happy that their children had the opportunity to go with kids to school with kids with significant needs, that it was really beneficial for them. So we spread that to the other schools. So now all buildings, when you leave early childhood and you need a more substantial program, you can get that in your home school. There are some children who, after we started it, they may have, let's say, a field home school and they're at Carpenter, they're 3rd grade. That was their home now, so we didn't want to pull everyone and say, you're going back to your home school. So it's like year by year, it changes. So within 3 years, everyone will be at their home school. And then home hospital services. There are some kids who are medically fragile who cannot attend school. So we provide services to them at home. And it might be 5 hours a week of tutoring, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech language. Home hospital, where we have a number of kids who, for physical or mental reasons, cannot attend either temporarily or long-term. And typically, if you're out for 10 days consecutively, if you have some type of medical issue, if we have an application for home hospital, then we can provide services to that child. And we try to be very flexible, because if we've got some kids who've got some significant health issues and they're in for 3 days, out for 2, in for 3, out for 2, it doesn't meet this consecutive 10 days, but we provide the tutoring, because otherwise they just fall hopelessly behind, and the state did see the wisdom of changing that so it doesn't have to be 10 days consecutively.
So Jim, kind of just an operational question on that. So how does that work? We send a teacher out to tutor them?
Yes. It's usually a tutor that's certified, who might be one of our substitutes.
Some of the sub out.
Yeah, we've actually also, sometimes the children have some significant needs, and we really need someone who really knows how to work with that child. So we may ask a teacher to go a Saturday or after school, and then we will pay them a tutor rate, and that's reimbursable money. And so we will try to get that child services, because sending just a tutor that doesn't know about the disability or about the child. So we try to be very flexible. We can find the tutors, but it's usually outside the school day.
It's no one's full-time job to go out and.
Correct. Some districts do have that, but no, but it's more cost effective to do it this way. And at the end of the year, when we submit our personnel grant, we submit all of our home hospital costs, and they get reimbursed at a partial rate from the state. We also have children who are hospitalized, and you know about these places, Streamwood or Alexian, whatever. So if a kid is hospitalized in a facility, then the home district is obligated to pay Streamwood or Alexian for tutoring. And the child is supposed to get an hour a day of tutoring. So we pay them, and then we hopefully get reimbursed. And so what they do is they send us a certification of the teachers and the background check of the teachers at the facility. And if you have a child, for example, at Children's Memorial, and they have a tutoring program, Lutheran General, we do that. So that's run out of our department.
How many kids do we have in that program?
Well, that's always ongoing. So at any time, there's probably 3 or 4 kids currently getting home hospital services. Kids undergoing chemo, a child, recently diagnosed with Hodgkin's, it's just flexible, and sometimes we let families bank hours because sometimes the kids are too sick to receive instruction, and so when they're better, then we could kind of bank the hours and give them like 2 hours a day, whatever the child is able to handle. And the teachers and the schools have been great about it. They're very supportive, and we clearly just give them the instructional materials that they're able to handle, like they don't have to make up science labs or things like that. And then there's state-operated or non-public programs. There's the Illinois School for the Hearing Impaired, Illinois School for the Visually Impaired, and we do not have any children at those facilities at this time. So, any questions so far? I know I'm kind of going fast, but a lot of information. Child find. We are responsible for actively seeking out and identifying all children from birth to 14 within our boundaries, and those parentally placed private school children for whom we're responsible, who may be eligible for special ed and related services. This requirement relates to the homeless children, children who are wards of the state, and highly mobile and migrant children. Procedures developed to fulfill the child find responsibilities shall include, I cut that part off, I forgot to take off the semicolon, and the shall include, but what we do is we have regular screenings. We have good relationships with our EI programs. EI is early intervention, that's birth to 2. 3 to 5 is our early childhood program, and then up to 14 is our K-8 program. But we actively have an obligation to try to find those students who are not in our public school. But for example, if somebody came to our school and they had a kindergartner and they're enrolling, and we noticed that they had a little 2 or 3-year-old with them, and those of us with the eye for can tell, might say, hey, we have this screening, here's a brochure, because it's in our best interest and certainly the child's best interest if there's something that we can catch early. Because nothing breaks my heart more than a kid who enrolls in kindergarten who never had services, who clearly needed them, and how far ahead they would have been had they had them. So it's in our best interest to try to find these kids as young as possible. And Leslie Lapping at EC at Jefferson is incredible, and she has really great relationships with all the different places. We work with our homeless liaison, Tom Buchler, who's the regional area, to try to make sure our homeless children are found and get service. And we currently have 12 children who are classified as homeless within the district. 12. A number of them are doubled up. So what means doubled up is that if you've lost your house because of financial reasons and then you're living with someone else, then you're considered homeless. We transport a child from Bridgeport, south side of Chicago, every day because the mother is very ill, and had to move in with her sister, and so we cab her. But 207 is a high school student too, so we kind of have a mutual arrangement where we cab the kid up here and then back. We have several kids in Des Plaines. We have a child in Hanover Park. We have a kid in Skokie and a kid in Evanston. So we are responsible for transporting them to and from their home to our district, because this is where they were when they became homeless. We then bill the other district, and we split the transportation. CPS is hard to get money out of, but we keep trying. But you split the homeless. So that's child finding. Not all kids who are homeless are special ed, but many of them are. But that's just one of the things that we have to do. Trying to think of the private school children, like the 4 private parochial schools. We have an obligation to help them too, but I think I talk more about that later. We then have an evaluation and determination of eligibility, part of our rules. There are 14 disabilities, and I put them on 2 different pages here. Autism, the new DSM-5, and Dr. Paterno, you can tell us what you think of that, but I know it's not much, and we tend to agree, but 1 in 68 children will be identified with some type of autism spectrum disorder, all the way from, your standard autism up to the high-functioning Asperger's or high-functioning autism, or however you want to call it, nonverbal learning disability, etc. Autism is on the rise, and we have probably about 6-7% of our special ed population has an identifiable autism spectrum disorder. Specific learning disability, that could be reading, writing, or math. Emotional disability, used to be termed behavior disorder, but now it's emotional disability. Traumatic brain injury, and that's only from an externalizing force. So if you have a car accident or something like that, it would not be like a brain tumor or anything like that. It's got to be external. Deafness, deaf-blind is a category. Vision impairment. And with the deafness and deaf-blind and visual impairment, we don't have a teacher of the hearing impaired. We don't have a teacher of the visually impaired. We don't have a orientation and mobility specialist on staff. So what was in our best interest was to have an IGA, one of which you approved this evening, intergovernmental association agreement with other districts. So for the kids who are deaf, we have an agreement with NSSEO, North Suburban Special Ed Organization, where they have a team, and they do audiologicals, and an audiological booth can cost upwards of $100,000, so it really is in our best interest to just pay them, for when they do an audiological, so we don't have to maintain our own. And so they have hearing itinerants. So they come out and they service our kids who have hearing issues. And I think, did Erin leave, Erin Breen? Erin had a student, and so she wore an FM system in her class where the student who was hearing impaired had a receiver, and she would be able to talk directly to that child because he couldn't hear. So the hearing itinerant from NSSEO would come work with Erin and help that kid so that that child could have access. The vision impairment, we have an IGA with District 62. They've hired 2 vision itinerants, and last year we needed a 0.4 because of the number of students we have. This next year we need a 0.3. And we have no kids getting O&M. O&M is orientation and mobility. That's generally when they're older. So if a kid who has a vision impairment who needs to learn how to use a cane and walk across the street, those are services schools provide. And so we would then have to contract for those services. So those are our IGAs with the hearing impaired and then the visually impaired. And we pay that district because that's much more financially. I think I repeated hearing, my apologies, but other health impaired, I think I talked before, but ADHD is probably the biggest one in that. And just so you know, and Dr. Paterno can correct me if I'm wrong, we used to term it ADD and then ADHD. Now there's only one. It's ADHD, 3 types. Your ADHD, primary inattentive, ADHD hyperactive, or ADHD combined. So you could have an ADHD inattentive, which on its face doesn't make a lot of sense, but there's no more ADD, it's ADHD for everyone. That's probably the biggest number of our other health impaired kids. kids who might have leukemia, juvenile diabetes, other types of issues. There has been in the past, some parents have struggled with the identification of their child as being on the autism spectrum, and so sometimes we have put spectrum disorders under other health impairment, et cetera, but it's kind of a wide-ranging category of kids. Developmental delay, that doesn't mean what we think of developmental delay as a cognitive impairment. That's for children who are 3, it used to be 3 to 6, and now it's 3 through age 9. And basically, if a child at 3 is found to have any delay in motor, cognitive, language, they can be eligible for early childhood services. And it helps us avoid labeling the kid early on. So when you get a child who's 3 years old and comes to you and they have Down syndrome, the automatic assumption is that they have an intellectual impairment. And a lot of people have a problem with that, about that's just too young. So we have a developmental delay, and that may likely what happened, but not always. The developmental delay is a kind of a catch-all. And so you can have that label, which is global, up through age 9, but after when you turn 10, you have to change it to something else. So those are our younger children. Intellectual impairment, you have to have a cognitive, that's where we don't do much IQ testing more in the district, but if we do, it would be for intellectual impairment. You have to have an IQ of 70 or below on the WISC, 69 on the Stanford-Binet, have adaptive behavior deficits, 2 standard deviations below the mean in 2 areas of adaptive behavior, plus achievement scores 2 standard deviations below the mean for that to be considered intellectual impairment. That title has changed from the R word, which we no longer use, to cognitive disability, and now it's intellectual impairment is the current title. Speech language is probably our biggest category. We have a lot of kids who have it standalone. We have a lot of kids who it's a secondary, where they may have a learning disability, but they also have a language impairment. And oftentimes you find kids who have reading difficulties also have language issues, and sometimes that's the root of the language issue. Multiple disabilities are those kids who might be deaf, blind, autism, and they have a number of them, and rather than have the parent endure, well, your kid has this, and this, we just say multiple. And it's for those kids who have more severe and profound disabilities. And orthopedic impairment is more your physical impairment, where you might have someone who's a little person, or has a missing limb or something. Some of those kids might be able to have a 504, but an IEP is something that they could also have, and we kind of look at each case by case. So, any questions so far?
Jim, I have one. I'm interested in the mechanics of this. I can see all the different scenarios that somebody might fall in for supplemental education, but where does the evaluation process begin? Is it the homeroom teacher identifies something, would notify you or your staff, or how is that contact initiated, and how is it determined the right individual comes down, or is it just an evaluation, and during the evaluation by whomever, they identify certain markers here, one of these eligibility markers, and then you go off into your different areas with your subspecialties. But is that pretty much how it works?
Yes, some children who very early on we know that they have a disability are going to come to your elementary school from early childhood with something that's identified. A child who starts the school system and the classroom teacher says, there's something wrong or something different, this child learns differently, we have problem-solving teams. There's grade-level problem-solving, there's individual problem-solving teams. There's a regular team at every school, a psychologist, social worker, resource gen ed teacher for that particular grade, special ed teacher, the administrator, psychologist, and they all get to speech, social work, they all get together, and so you can bring children to that team, and we say, basically, we ask for a discrepancy statement. What is this child doing that everyone else is doing that they can't? For example, if all the other kids know 23 letters and this child knows 4, well, then we're concerned, so we say, what are we going to do about it? So that's the whole idea about response to intervention. We come up with a plan as to how we can have that child catch up on whatever discrepancy area they have so that they can be at their peer performance. And so it's done by a team or by a committee, and then that process continues. They bring the parents in. We meet on a regular basis. It could either be done as a team. For example, all the third grade teachers at Carpenter could get together and say, we just administered the MAP test. And we found that of the 80 kids we measured, 5 were outliers. They had a problem in this one MAP strand. And they may decide, okay, we're going to give them this extra intervention during this period of time, get all 5 together and give them this instruction, and then measure the progress. So that's grade level problem solving, where you try to do it not one at a time, but as a group, where you identify groups of students. And then the individual, we have the individual problem solving team. And then eventually, when you put all these interventions in place, whether it's Wilson reading, read naturally, corrective reading, reading mastery, math connections, Math Connect, you can then see, is the child catching up? And when we say, yeah, they're catching up, but it's only because we're really giving them like a whole bunch of extra support, so we may decide, okay, we can't continue to maintain this without being in special ed, and they say, okay, they're eligible. The ideal situation is that we give them so much support, they catch up, and then we're okay. They just needed catching up. Mm-hmm. So it's individual, it's group, but every child is different, and we try to look at each child differently. Does that answer your question?
It does. And when you have this group evaluation, does each individual in the group do their own independent evaluation, or can one individual identify numerous eligibility markers, or how is that?
The team will look at all of the data. And I think you do think as a group, like the psychologist might say, I'm going to do some time on task. If there's a child who's only engaged, we view them as off task, we might do a time on task. We may send psychologists, a psych intern in, ask a special ed teacher to go in. We may look at a 30-minute sample of a child's day, and we find out that they're engaged 28% of the time, and average over these three times. And the gen ed kids, we also measure them, because sometimes classes tend to be, some are different than others, and we say, okay, the class average is 80, they're engaged 28, so we have a discrepancy there. What are we going to do about it? So everyone's involved. So every time we get together, and every school does it differently. Psychologists do some things, speech paths do others. It's kind of like flexible service delivery. We really focus on breaking down the boundaries of, this is your role. It's like whoever can benefit the kid, whoever can help the child is good. We've had situations where we've had kids with behavioral issues who have wonderful relationships with our custodial staff. And so we built in like behavior contracts where if you do all this work, you can help someone with recycling, and that's motivating and it works. Or you get to read with the custodian, or there's a lunch lady you have a special relationship. Anything that works is what we'll try to do.
Sure. Thank you.
Sure. Then the IEP, Individualized Education Program, once a child is made eligible, and we answer the question of, do they have a disability? Yes or no? If it's yes, okay. Do they have needs we've identified that require special education? Yes? Okay. Then we have to identify what are those needs. And that would be in the IEP. And the IEP is a legal document that we have to follow. If we don't, there's all types of different problems, that we could face if we're not implementing them. So it's got to have a statement of the child's present level of academic achievement and functional performance, how the disability affects his or her involvement in the curriculum, and for preschool children, as appropriate, how the disability affects the child's participation in appropriate activities. So every IEP has to have a statement of what their present level of performance is and how they differ from others in achievement and functional performance. And then each IEP has to have a statement of measurable annual goals that reflect consideration of the state goals and the Illinois Learning Standards are now Common Core, as well as benchmarks or short-term objectives developed in accordance with the child's present level of educational performance. And I cut out the rest of that, obviously. So what we would do is we would say a child has a specific learning disability in reading fluency and math calculation. We say the present level of performance is that a fourth grade student in winter is able to read 97 words correctly per minute, with 97% accuracy. This child reads 33 words per minute. In a year, we want to cut the difference in half and say we're going to get them to 70 or 60. We have benchmarks for every trimester, the same as the grading periods, that we're going to get you to 40 to 50 to 60. Same with math. What's the discrepancy between peers? Where's the child at? How are we going to close the gap? And our goal is to close the gap so that they don't need it any longer. And so every IEP has to have goals and deficit areas. Some kids have 12 goals. Some kids have 2 goals. Depends on the child. Some kids have a goal in writing, math, reading, organization, speech language, might be expressive, receptive, artic, pragmatics, or vocabulary. So many of them are quite wide-ranging. And then it's designed to meet the child's needs that result from the child's disability to enable the child to be involved in and make progress in the general curriculum, or for preschool to participate in age-appropriate activities. So our goal is always to try to get the child to make progress in the gen ed curriculum, and for preschool, age-appropriate activities. So our target is always, if you're a 4th grader, what is every other 4th grader doing? And that's our goal. And obviously for some kids who are highly discrepant, that gets harder as they get older. But we do our best. The IEP has to have a statement of the special ed and related services. So it will say they're going to get resource support of 200 minutes a week, 100 of which is reading, 100 of which is math. They're going to get speech language of 40 minutes a week. So every IEP details what the services are and how they're delivered. Supplementary aids and services and program modifications. It might be, okay, you're going to get the support of a teacher assistant in your content area classes, in your science or social science, and then you may get modifications or supports. There's modifications where they may have reduced amount of work, or accommodations, they may get extra time, etc. There's lots of different ones that we don't want to get into all of them tonight. So that the statement, they advance appropriately towards attaining the goals, and they also have to be involved in and make progress in the general curriculum and participate in extracurricular and non-academic activities, and be educated and participate with other children with and without disabilities. So all of those things have to be addressed in the IEP, and sometimes there's check boxes and forms, but we have to have a statement made to cover all those areas, because those are a requirement. These are statement of any individual accommodations that are necessary, achieve academic achievement and functional performance of the child on state and district-wide assessments, or a statement of why they can or cannot participate. All of our kids take ISAT, now PARC, and some of our kids take alternatives, and I'll get into that. So every IEP has to have a statement as to what are we going to do differently on the ISAT, what are we going to do differently on the PARC, what are we going to do differently on the MAP. So we have to describe. They get extended time, they get a scribe, they get a note taker, they get headphones, they get the script read to them. So whatever they need to make it a level playing field to mitigate the disability, we give those accommodations for those children. One of the issues on PARC that's good is they have a lot of automatic accommodations built in that the principal can give to anybody, and you don't need an IEP, because the point is you don't want the PARC to be a test of how good you are with technology. It's what you know. And so they're making all these things. So if you want to give the PARC to a kid who's nervous and you want to give it to them where they're just by themselves or in a small group, you could do that without an IEP. Or a PNP, which is a plan that we do for PARC for some kids, but that's another issue. So the IEP has to have that statement. And then the projected beginning date for the services and modifications, and the amount, frequency, and anticipated duration of those services. Every IEP goes a year. As the maximum, it could be less. But we usually make our goals a year. So if we do it now for March, we write them from March 2014 to March 2015. If we have a child who's transitioning from 5th to 6th, or EC to K, or 8th to high school, we sometimes have bridge IEPs where we go up to the end of the year and then we write one into the next school year. But they go a year. And just so you know, every child who has a disability is reevaluated every 3 years to redetermine if they're eligible or not. but the IEP is an annual. Parent could always ask for an IEP meeting. We've had parents where we have monthly IEP meetings because they want regular updates. But it's annual is typically how we do it. The related services, there are probably 25 of them that are really available, but these are the main ones. Speech language, every building generally has a speech language pathologist. Any buildings generally have 30 to 50 of their kids getting some type of services. Social work or counseling are related services given on IEPs. Occupational therapy is on an IEP, and you also need a prescription for the occupational therapy. They changed that law where you didn't have to, but now to get Medicaid reimbursement, you do. Physical therapy, health services. We have kids right now, I think we're up to like 18 kids with type 1 diabetes who need regular, we have glucagon, we have the insulin, obviously. We have kids who need flushes, who need tube feeding, and so our nurses are very busy because we have a number of kids with health issues. That would be on the IEP with a health plan. Assistive technology is a related service where that's another IGA where we contract with 207 for somebody 2 days a week who comes out and she does our assistive technology evaluation. And then something that we're very proud of, we're starting up adaptive physical education, which is an IEP thing. It will not cost anything additional. We're converting our programming, and one of our PE teachers is getting their certification as we speak. And so in the fall, we will have adaptive physical education and be in compliance with regard to that particular, because in the past we were having like small groups of 1 or 2 kids getting pulled out services from a PE teacher, and this is better because they're trained in adaptive PE, and the goal is to provide them support in the regular PE class, but give them IEP minutes. I know this is dry. Any questions so far? Okay. We're getting there. We have to report child's progress as frequently as other kids. So when you get a report card for your child, if your child has an IEP, you should get a report card on the IEP saying, here's the progress on their goals. And if you're not, then something's not happening right. But they should get, at least as often as everybody else, an update on the goals on the IEP. Also, the IEP has to have an explanation of the extent, if any, to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the general class and extracurricular and non-academic activities. So if we are ever going to say a student cannot participate in something, we have to have an explanation as to why on the IEP. Most districts are lacking in this regard. We kind of just make that decision. Sometimes it might be as simple as, you know what, this child really likes science and social science, but for this year, we're going to have them do science this year and social science next year because they really need an intensive reading support. And we ask the parents to prioritize with us, and that's okay. You could write that in the IEP. Like, what's the most important thing? Reading, probably, for some of these kids. But you have to address it. But the default position is that all these kids get to participate in all their extracurricular activities and art, music, PE, etc. And if they cannot, we have to indicate why on the IEP. A statement as to whether the child requires extended school year services and a description of those services. We are mandated to provide those services. We give 6 weeks a year, and we provide all of the related services that they get during the regular school year. We do get a minimum amount of state reimbursement for ESY, but we do run that program every year at Washington and Lincoln. We do try to have those kids participate in some of the Gen Ed Worlds of Wonder offerings. So Nancy Jensen is our summer school principal for special ed, and she does a wonderful job with that. It's a very good program. Statement as to the languages or modes of communication in which special ed related services will be provided, if other than or in addition to English. So increasingly, our limited English proficient population is doubled in 3 years, and it's going to increase. So the language issue will be a larger issue as we go forward. But we have to address as to, is the fact that they don't speak English, how does that impact their disability? Is that why they're not performing, etc.? So it's very complicated, but we have to look at it, and we cannot ignore, not that we have, but it's an increasing issue. And then once a child reaches 14 and a half, and so since we're not a high school district, this doesn't overly impact us, but we do have a number of eighth graders who turn 14 and a half during the year of their IEP that's written in eighth grade. We have to write a transition plan where we look at the 4 areas I mentioned before: education, employment, education or training, independently living, and we have to make a prediction as to what are they going to do when they're 22, when they get out of school, or 18 when they get out of school. That's often a very hard conversation for parents to have, but what it does is it starts us thinking that, okay, I want to be in food service, or I want to go to community college, or I want to go to a four-year college. We document that, and we say, well, then what do you need to do to get there? And we'll write in the IEP they need to have a college-bound course of study at the high school. So it's different, but it's a good thing, and it's probably much more relevant in the high school. But it's a mandate that we have to do transition planning for kids.
How many students do you have to do that with on a given year?
Well, I would say probably 30, 40. Because a lot of parents, those kids that are held back, kindergarten, when they hit eighth grade, they turn 14 and a half younger. So if they're going to be 14 and a half, if you write an IEP in December and it goes to next December and they're 14 and a half during that time period, then you got to put it in there. But it's a good thing, and just so you know too that we're having this really great presentation by Robert Farley, who's an attorney from Naperville, and he has a son who I know well out of Naperville 203, who he has advocated for adult services. And so what he's going to do is he's going to have a free presentation for all the parents in the district that are interested in Roosevelt School. I think the info will be coming out soon, Bernadette, right? And he's going to talk about Social Security, disability, guardianship. Because what I find here is that since we're EC 8 district, no one really talks about what the future lies ahead. And I've had some great conversations with parents about, volunteer at Misericordia. Sister Rosemary will want you to do that, because people have to think about what's going to happen to their kid, because you've got some kids with significant needs, and adult services in the state are poor at best. And so he's going to talk about to parents about what things you need to do when you apply for Social Security, when you apply for PUNS, which is the State Priority Urgent Needs Program. So he's going to be there for some of our kids, for our parents of some of our needier kids. So it's never too early to start planning. It doesn't mean you make a decision, but you need to know what's out there, because once, the kids grow up quickly, and it's tough. And just so you know, it doesn't affect us, but children who have more moderate to severe and profound needs, they're entitled to go to school until their 22nd birthday. So a lot of these kids go to high school for 4 years. Kids with a specific learning disability graduate, go on to college, community college, work, whatever they do. Kids with a cognitive impairment who have a significant health impairment, other issues, they may need transition. So there's a transition program where you're at 18, 19, 20, 21. You go for three years more. And so when you're at your 22nd birthday, you're done. So that's more of a high school issue. So that's why some of these things say through 21 inclusive. So I ran the Naperville 203 transition program, and our goal was to get those kids ready for adulthood, because there's not a lot of adult job offerings there, and the kids would just sit home. Student participation in assessments. ISAT, there's always been an IAA, the Illinois Alternate Assessment. Well, PARC, now there's the DLM, Dynamic Learning Map. So some of those kids who are nonverbal or very minimal academic skills, we have an alternate for PARC that we're field testing at the same time as PARC. So all the stuff that happens in Gen Ed, we're doing our own version of it too, so I just wanted you to be aware of that. Martha Rohde is handling that system.
Jim?
Yes?
Of the, 700, right? You said 700 kids? How many of them, they're not all taking those different assessments, so there's just a small percentage
probably
of them?
20 kids.
Okay, that's what I thought.
You can only have 1% of your total population take an alternate assessment, of those kids taking like 3rd through 8th. So that for us would be about 27 kids, so we're under that. You can go to 2% if you ask for a waiver of the state, but the state wants most everybody to take it, and there should be very few exceptions, which is problematic because some of those kids, it's really painful to watch them take it, but we do try it if we could exempt them we will. LRE, least restrictive environment. This is from our rules and regs. Supports the right of children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. Child's placement shall be based on the child's IEP and shall be as close as possible to the child's home. Unless the IEP of a child with a disability requires some other arrangement, the child shall be educated in the school that he or she would attend if non-disabled. A placement determination based solely upon the category of a child's disability or on the current configuration of a district service delivery system is prohibited. In selecting the least restrictive environment, consideration shall be given to any potential harmful effects on the child or on the quality of services received. Some of you may have remembered a court case called Corey H. in Chicago. And basically in Chicago, if you had this label, you went here and had this program. If you had this label, you went here and had this program without regard to the individual needs. This is basically saying, you know, you can't do it based on a category. You can't do it based on, well, this is what our program offers, so whoever's in this program gets this. Can't do that. We have to do what's individual for that child. And that's why all the state certification for special ed teachers changed. The certification used to be TMH, EMH, severe and profound. You would get trained and get your certification based on you're a teacher of students who are educably mentally handicapped. Those were all certifications. Those were all thrown out with the Corey H case. And now it's LBS 1, LBS 2, Learning Behavior Specialist 1, Learning Behavioral Specialist 2, without regard for the individual disability. So that's been a big change in HR and the whole world of special ed. And then children with disabilities must be allowed to participate to the maximum extent appropriate with non-disabled children in non-academic and extracurricular activities, including meals, recess periods, athletics, clubs, and recreational activities. So if we have a child at Emerson who has pretty much a one-on-one assistant during the day, and they want to be in the school play or in the chess club or whatever, we supply a staff person after school and pay them to make that child able to participate, because that's the law. And it's a good thing because they're part of the school community. So I don't know if you knew that or not, but we cannot say to a child, well, you can't participate because you have a disability. We have to allow it. Now, there are some situations like an extracurricular activity or a sports, where if the child physically cannot do it and they don't meet the criteria for other kids, it's reasonable and that no, you can't participate, but sometimes it's a fine line. There was a recent case about a one-armed swimmer who couldn't participate in their school sports because the rule was you had to touch with both hands. So those of you who have swimmers in your family, that must be a rule someplace. And so the family said, well, that's not fair because the kid was disqualified because he only had one arm. So they changed the rule and said that was not a reasonable restriction, so they were able to allow that kid to do that. And everyone was happy about that. So a lot of the litigation, I get these 504 compliance and LRP legal compliance things, and there's lots of things with regard to this topic. But I think we haven't had a problem here, and our staff has been very gracious about that. Extended school year, I talked about that. For a child with an IFSP, that's another term. IEP is 3 to 22. IFSP is 0 to, or birth to 2. And we are obligated to give them an IEP or an evaluation by the age of 3. And so that's why Leslie Lapping is out there finding all these birth to 2 programs and finding these kids. And we have regular screenings where people bring their kids to our screenings or EI contacts us. So that's why we need staffing over the summer. You may have seen some of those bills and expenses. So if a child turns 3 on July 8th, it doesn't matter if school's in session or not, we have to make a determination. So we have IEP meetings throughout the summer for those kids turning 3 because we want to get them the services. And so that's... Most doctors know preschool programs, Montessori. They will tell people to contact us on a regular basis to come get these services. And just people out there saying, you've got to have a child. And you may say, by the way, is that child getting any type of services? There's a free screening available in this district wherever you live. So just kind of spreading the word. Earlier the better. Serving students who attend non-public schools or those who are homeschooled. You may not realize this, but we serve kids with disabilities at Mary Seat of Wisdom, St. Paul, Embers, and St. Andrews. And that there's the Science Academy, if it's still there, I think we did a couple years ago. Is that still there, the one up by, right? Yeah, because we served them before. Okay, what happens is that we get a little over $1 million a year from IDEA, from the federal government. We have to give them a census of our private schools. We have approximately 1,700 children who are in private parochial schools in Park Ridge, our boundaries. So that's calculated, and we have to then provide, we're given a proportionate share calculation. Our calculation is roughly around $100,000. We have to spend $100,000 per year on private parochial services. We cannot use that money for child find. So if someone from Mary Seat of Wisdom says, I have a fourth grader, I think they have a learning disability, please test them. We put them through the same procedure as we do our public students. If they do qualify for students, we do give them services at parochial school. The timely and meaningful consultation is a meeting we have with the parochial schools, and we say, okay, you have $100,000, how do you want to spend it? Basically, we've spent more than that, because it's my understanding that at the prior referendum, that it was told to the community, and this is just what I've been told, that we would maintain the level of services regardless of proportionate share. And right now we have a full-time speech path, we have 2 half-time social workers, we have a half-time resource teacher, and then we have a .2 facilitator. And so those people provide services to the private parochial schools. We have excellent relationships with them. They're very happy with the services, and our timely and meaningful consultations tend to go very well. It's on May 1st at Washington at 4 o'clock this year. We then have to report to the state and get a written affirmation from each of the parochial schools to sign that they've agreed to this, and then we submit that to the state. And I go to a number of the meetings, but we do have that private parochial program, and I don't know if you were aware of that, but they're very happy. We also have homeschool kids, so we have to annually advertise, and so I have to get it on the website. I don't know if they give you that, Bernadette. And we have to post in the newspaper. It should come next week. On May 1st, at the district office at 5 o'clock, I'm hosting a meeting of all parents who homeschool who have a child with disabilities to come ask us about any services that their child requires. Some years you don't get anybody, some years we get a few people who come. But that's a requirement of the law, and then I have to send the state a copy of the advertisement. For example, we have a field parent last week who has a child with a speech disability. She's chosen to homeschool her child, but her child would benefit from 30 minutes a week of our TIC therapy. So a parent brings the child to field on Tuesdays at 8 o'clock, let's say, or 8:30, and they get 30 minutes of speech services. So we are required to service those kids. The other interesting fact you might want to know is that the law changed, and for the private parochial schools, is that all kids attending schools that are in our boundaries are eligible. So, for example, Mary Seat of Wisdom is probably 1/4 to 1/3 kids who do not live in Park Ridge. Most live in Chicago. So we service quite a few kids who live in Chicago but go to school in Park Ridge. So you may not realize that, but that's what we do, because that's the law.
Homeschool children who have, whether they have a disability or not.
Right now we have 2. It's not a huge number.
Oh, Jim, that's to say 2 to whom you provide services, right?
Yes, to who, right.
Okay.
Right. All the kids who are homeschooled that don't need, who don't have an IEP, we don't keep track of that. No. Yeah, thank you. That's probably the vast majority. And we have had a number of requests, because I get the calls for that about, I want to homeschool my child, but when they get to middle school, they want to participate in activities at middle school. And so our board policy is that you can participate in extracurriculars if you attend for half a day, including lunch. There's lunch. I always have to look it up, but I get those calls. So we have a number of parents who do that. But if you don't, then you cannot participate. That's board policy. Any questions about this? Okay. Procedural safeguards. We have a legal safeguards that are posted on our website, and we give these to parents at these times. Annually, initial evaluation, disciplinary removals, request by parent, and upon receipt of this first state complaint and upon first request for a due process hearing in a school year. So we have to give out procedural safeguards. Briefly, behavior intervention and discipline. If a child has an emotional disability, if a child who has been then manifested in behaviors in the class, they have a functional assessment and a behavior intervention plan. Those are part of the IEP, and they're our Tier 3 assessment, or Tier 3 intervention. We have to maintain data, we identify target behaviors, we measure it, and then we update it based on our interventions, whether or not it's successful or not. A child with an IEP can be suspended up to 10 days. If a child if we call a parent of an IEP and we say they're really having a problem, they're going home at 2 o'clock, counts as a full day. So I tell people, use your suspension sparingly because you only have 10. If we suspend a child from a bus who has an IEP, and that bus suspension limits their ability to come to school, that counts as an external suspension. We tend to try to do internal suspensions, and if we give kids access to their instruction during the school day, that will not count as an external. There is a 45-day interim alternative to expulsion, interim alternate educational setting, which is where if a child brings a knife, weapon, or there is significant bodily harm, we can remove that child to a 45-day school day placement at a private or public day. And we've done that 3 times in the last 3 years. Expulsions, manifestation determinations. You cannot expel a student with an IEP, generally. You have to continue services. You can remove them from the school system, but you have to continue services at private or public day. If a kid does not have an IEP, they can be expelled for up to 2 years. Manifestation determinations. If a child does something that is something that you could expel or do a 45 or even a 10, and there is concern about whether or not that infraction was a manifestation of their disability, we do a manifestation determination meeting. We had a situation 2 weeks ago where we had a manifestation where a violation was and occurred, and we had a meeting and we looked at all the evidence and all the history, and we decided it was not a manifestation of the disability and that we could then continue to discipline the child as though they were not special education. We came to an agreement where the parents agreed to get the child the support that he very much needed, and that was a good result, and the child was able to remain at school after that. So those are some behavior intervention and discipline issues. Any questions about that? And I know these could all be their own cows, behavior and discipline and things like that. The last slide is I just wanted to share with you, and Becky had asked me if I was doing anything financial tonight, and if you wanted, right, Becky? Yeah, she was nervous that she'd have to get up
She
here.
wants to make sure, yeah, she gets.
Right. So my last slide I just thought would be interesting for you was that private public day therapeutic. During the 12-13 school year, we had students in private public day facilities for part or all of the school year. The annual cost was $1,759,000. The state reimbursed $469,000. The net cost of the district was $1,289,000. The net cost per student was $34,843, and the range of net cost was $26,664 to $96,751. The higher net costs for those public day where there is no reimbursement. The state reimbursement is only for private day facilities. And just so you know how that works, is that, let's say we have a private day facility, that the tuition is $60,000 per year. Our per cap, 11, 13, okay. what we do is we say, the state says we will reimburse you above 2 times per cap. So we pay the first 26,000. So the 26,000 to the 60,000 is 34,000. We would tend to get that 34,000 back. The state used to give 100%. So what they do now is they prorate, as they're doing with state aid. So that proration was 85%, and it's probably going down to closer to 70. So we're getting less and less reimbursement for private day. There's also provision that they're changing it from 2 times per cap to 3 times per cap, which will be a hit of probably 150,000 if that goes through. So the costs for private public day therapeutic are, are significant, and that's reflected. It is lower, we have gotten it down to a good degree, but that's one of the costs. That's probably the largest cost. Of course, there are other costs, with regard to, in programs in school. Special ed costs are greater, obviously, than general ed costs. And in the future, if you want more information, because as years go by, we get closer to the referendum, I think looking at costs in every area is appropriate, even special ed. There are probably some efficiencies and things that we could probably do that we have tried to do. But I will close on that note. Not sure if that was exactly what you were looking for. It was kind of a broad overview. But if there's other areas you want more information on in the future, I'd be happy to provide that.
Jim, can I ask a question on this slide? So this would sort of indicate that there's roughly 50 kids that are in the private public therapeutic.
This is there's some kids who went for the 45-day, and so it's a range. There's probably a little under 30 kids.
On and ongoing throughout the year.
Right. Right. It's a range. We've got kids that our cost per year is probably about $100,000. And we've got kids that are costing $25,000, $30,000. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I did the math.
Yeah, so it's a wide range of costs. And it also, this does not include transportation, which is probably $20,000 per kid, so probably another $600,000 in transportation costs. Because we bus kids, we bus a kid to Burr Ridge, bus kids to Northbrook, bus kids to Evanston.
Yeah, I see that as a separate line on the financials. I do look at those.
Reimbursement has generally been 80%.
It's going down. Special
Right.
ed is still being reimbursed.
Right.
But it's being prorated more.
So of the 600,000 roughly, we get 80% of that back, but that will be falling.
And then my guess is you could do a similar chart for the other sort of programs that we have for special ed altogether. I guess it's very telling, right, that a large part of our budget in dollars are going to this group of kids, which is fine, but I think the general public doesn't see that and doesn't understand it. So we get these questions, why is it $13,000 per kid? When in fact, if you broke these kinds of things out, you probably end up in a range that's much less than that, right? Because you're sort of factoring all of this in. Now, whether that's the right thing to do or not, but it's certainly something to sort of think about.
Yeah, it's hard to quantify because, for example, if you have a speech pathologist who has a caseload of 50 and they're making 50, 60, you could say that the cost for that child, $1,000, $1,500 a year. You have other children that the cost for transportation is $120,000 per year.
Yeah.
So when you calculate it and you say, okay, the average cost of special education is this, it's really not a great accurate number. I think what you look at too is, the amount of what we spend on special ed, what percentage of the whole budget is that, and compare it to other places, et cetera. But we're pretty comparable to other districts. But I think special ed, as everywhere, is it's a big expense.
It's a growing expense. It's probably
we've actually, our MO actually fell.
Yeah. Jim has done it.
Yeah. Maintenance of effort. When we get our funding, it's kind of ironic that if your expenses don't go up, the government assumes something is wrong and you have to explain that. So our MO, our maintenance of effort, went down, actually, our expenses. And so we explained that we had some different placement issues that we did.
Do the kids that need special food, does that fall under you?
Special food?
If they can't afford a meal or?
No, that would be under free and reduced lunch type of things. But we do have to pay for a number of different things. Assistive technology, we have some kids, like a stander, a child with a, who had cerebral palsy or traumatic brain injury and they needed a stander. They can be $5,000-$6,000 and they change, they grow bigger and we need different equipment. So a lot of our adaptive and assistive tech equipment, rift and chair, and that we also have to supply some of these kids we have at other facilities that are very medically fragile. We have to have a full-time nurse with them because they have a significant seizure activity. Some of our more expensive situations are where we have to provide additional medical support for the child.
I'd like to make a comment. In my work, I do a lot of psychoeducational testing, and I go to a lot of IEP meetings, and I write a lot of psych reports about special ed. And I'm just constantly impressed with how this district creates individual education plans and programs, how they work with 504 plans. In the meetings that I've gone to and with the students that I've seen and in the IEPs that have been written, they've all been stellar, almost without exception. And even more importantly than that, the staff, the principals, the teachers, special ed folks, social workers, psychologists, all of that, follow through with an IEP plan, which if you've been in this business long enough, you know that a lot of schools, they can write a beautiful IEP. They can say, we understand the child and this is what the child needs, and then we don't do any of it. But this district I've seen follows through with IEPs, and I've just been constantly impressed with that. So I'm sure that in part that's because of your work, Jim, but the principals and the staff have also done a great job with it. And so I just want to commend the whole special ed department and all of the gen ed teachers and social workers and principals at doing a really good job of that.
On behalf of all the teachers and the staff, thank you.
And thank you, Jim, for bringing us this information. And
Can I ask one question? I'm sorry.
Of course.
Yeah, I actually have two questions, but I want to do one quick one. Okay, if you have one concern about this district regarding special ed that the board members need to be aware of, that it would be wise for us to know, what would that be?
Can I think about that?
Sure.
Get back to you?
Yeah. And then, I noticed that the percentage of special ed students, at least who have IEPs, has gone down from 20% or something to 14. And I know we also have some 504 plan kids, but is that mostly because of RTI? Would you suggest that because we're using that model, that's how we've lowered?
I think that RTI is, yes, it's caused the conversation, but the mindset used to be, if we don't get this kid an IEP, we failed.
Okay.
And to me, the question is, if we give the kid an IEP, we failed.
Okay, so it's been more of a culture change.
Yes, and that's difficult for families, for staff. A lot of staff are used to the old IQ testing, and we got to get this kid an IEP, and it's my mission to get him an IEP, and I'm thinking, no, give him what he needs. Don't label him. Maybe he needs to be labeled eventually. So I guess would be the just try to give children what they need outside of special education, and probably to merge more special ed with general ed. So I think sometimes I would see the vision being that we tend to compartmentalize children, and we say that someone else will take care of the problem, when it'd be nice if everyone owned the children in the school, and I think we've made great progress with that. So I know that's vague, but
no, I appreciate that, because I agree with you on this. I think you know that I think the numbers should go lower, and some of that is by preventative measures, and some of it is by, exactly as you say, let's give the child what he or she needs so that we don't have to do an IEP. We don't have to label a child in order to give him or her services. And I think that's really great that if more teachers in schools really believed in that, and we did even more of that, I think that would really benefit us. So, okay, thanks.
And again, Jim, thank you for taking the time to do this. I know that we all needed to get some background and definitions, and and how these things are pulled together, and the depth and breadth of services that are provided for folks who need them. And I, for one, was not aware of all of the background that goes into these things, so I do appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. That brings us to one final issue. I've been contacted by several people in the community, I know some other board members have, concerning two recent programs that were offered through our district. One, the Illinois Youth Survey. Folks might have heard about that. And the other program was a recently concluded program at Lincoln, ostensibly an anti-bullying program that we're going to hear a little bit more about, but there is some concern about the communication between the district and the families to let folks know what this is going to be about. So taking these one at a time, I'd like to talk about the Illinois Youth Survey first. This is a program that's offered every other year. We have done it 2 years ago. It was recently performed at Lincoln School, and it is scheduled for Emerson in May. The test is offered to students in the 7th grade?
6th and 8th.
6th and 8th. And the test comes with some recommendations on how to advertise this test. And I don't know if anybody's actually gone and taken the test or seen the questions.
I have. And I want to just caution that it's not really a test, it's a survey.
Survey, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Survey.
it's more accurate.
Yeah.
It's a survey.
And Dathan, how would you describe this particular survey as far as the attitudes that it tries to glean from a student and his relationships with family and school and environmental relationships?
Yeah, it gets at some really interesting questions about a person's exposure to a wide range of drugs and alcohol, their exposure to drugs and alcohol at home, parental, familial attitudes about drugs and alcohol, whether the child has access to drugs and alcohol at home, things like that. It also gets into mood, suicidal thoughts, stuff like that. There are questions such as, do you agree that you have somebody to talk to at home when things are, something like that, I'm paraphrasing. But very personal questions about the child and the child's family.
So it's a voluntary test, or?
It's, I think, a
Survey.
Questionable.
Voluntary.
Yeah, it's questionably voluntary.
Well, that's
part of the problem.
That was one of the questions that were raised because it is a voluntary program, but students were, from what I have heard, students were told to just check off the box that says, yes, you'll take this, and immediately start taking the survey without the ability to opt out. So that being said, I direct myself now to Dr. Bender from the district's point of view as to how the test is conducted and what opportunities are given to students and or families to decide if they want to participate in this test.
We've had a history in District 64 long before I arrived of taking the Illinois Youth Survey. We have questioned in the past whether or not we should do it. Those of you who lived in this community, I think unless you lived with your head in the sand, this community does have issues with alcohol abuse and now moving into substance abuse. It's out there. If you talk to law enforcement, if you've ever been on a ride along on the weekends, it's prevalent in the community. Don't put your head in the sand. It's here. The question is whether or not the information gleaned from this provides that kind of response. I know over the years, at least from my seat, parents have been notified that they do have the option to opt out. I can't tell you how clear it's been. We've questioned the clarity of that. In fact, I think as we were looking through it, There were other options of even actually sending a letter home to parents via U.S. mail concerning the survey and whether or not they wanted to take it. We know that in the process that we've done thus far, that we've had, I think, 2 parents opt out at Lincoln and 4 opt out at Emerson. I can't tell you the value. I can tell you that the Maine Community Assistance Foundation, MyCAF, is certainly interested in the data that's gleaned from it, because it certainly helps them to direct programs within the community concerning alcohol and substance abuse. They feel very confident that that information helps in that area. I can tell you there was an issue about 3 years ago that because of this particular survey, there was a child that was reaching out for help. And those folks who were looking at that survey brought it to the school's attention. It was brought to DCFS. The child was pulled out of the home because it was found to be an abusive home. This, in that instance, allowed that child to reach out that evidently didn't feel comfortable in any other kind of mode. That's only one instance. You know, I'm certainly of the belief that parents should simply have the option to opt out if they want to, you know, to be involved in that type of a survey.
Well, I have a 6th grader at Emerson, and I believe I did get a letter, a 2-page letter sent to my home that said that my daughter would be taking this, and I was comfortable with it, so I didn't take any action.
The letter that you received, Vic, how long ago was that?
Well, she hasn't taken the test yet, so
Yeah,
I,
it's
you know, I got it well within a month.
Yeah, and that's a point, because as we were investigating, we were finding out that we probably needed to do a little bit more in getting the information out. And so the Emerson families did get the letter in the mail concerning that. I don't believe the Lincoln folks did because of the timing issue.
And I think that's
involved there.
From what I've heard from the community, I think the survey information perhaps has some validity. I talked to my wife and children about this test, and they've taken the test, and they had no problems about it, but there was some information that did come home about the test, and at least we knew about it. And from what I glean is that the content and intent of the survey was not given to the families from Lincoln. So there was that side of it, that families have the right to know what is going to occur in school and whether they feel that it's appropriate for their own child to opt out or opt in. And that wasn't given the option. And in fact, in at least this one instance that was related to me was the teachers just said, just check that box and start taking the survey and don't worry about it. So the child was not given the option. It was just check it and get going and let's get this over with. And I don't think that's the intent of the survey. But I believe, and we've as a board had this discussion before about, you know, making things clear to families and having better communication with families. And I think this is an opportunity. The take-home message here, at least, is to converse and be upfront with folks and give them that information, just as you received for your child at Emerson. Had that been done at Lincoln, I don't think that this would be an issue.
Dr. Bender, have we thought about doing maybe some blasts or, you know?
Well, and as we were reviewing this, we came to the conclusion, you know, since I came on board, this board's completely changed, basically, with the exception of one. That's John Heide. And that's a lot of change in 4 years, not very usual. And normally, we usually have, in the past, we've had people come in and talk to the board about what the survey is about. So that's on the agenda soon, to have someone come in and actually speak to the survey, what it is, you know, give you a little bit better idea even than what I can do. I think the issue here is making sure that parents have the opportunity to opt out if they so choose, on this survey. As I said earlier, we've even talked about before, it always comes at an inopportune time of the year because we've done testing and we've done all these things, and so now we ask the staff to administer the survey, which is probably why somewhere along the line we've encountered this thing, just check it, let's go, because people just want to get it done and not really, think methodical about it. But that's information that all probably needs to be presented to the board, what this is all about, what do they do with the data? We don't do anything with the data. Once they do have the data, what do they do with it, how they compile that data, what they use with it, how it actually comes back and benefits the community. That would probably be a nice report for the board to hear. And John, you maybe have remembered having this happen before. I don't know.
Well, I believe I recall that the board used to receive a report with results from the survey every year. At some point during the summer, I remember getting either a presentation or a memo of information in my board packet with, we administered the Illinois Youth Survey. Here are some data that we got from the youth survey. And we could see over time how, for instance, the number of students who said they had used alcohol within the last month, whether that had gone up, down, et cetera. I haven't seen that in the last couple of years, but at one point in time, I know we used to get these memos.
Dr. Bender, could I add something?
Sure.
You were going to speak, but Dr. Hinton, who can't be here tonight, she's ill, but we've talked extensively with the administration about this issue, and I think we both feel and the team feels that, we want to respect parents' opportunity for choice, and in this case, we did not follow the protocol of the Illinois Youth Survey and did not send a letter when that was the protocol. That needs to be corrected, and that's a problem. An email probably was not sufficient, so I think we want to look at that corrected. I think Dr. Hinton and we talked about how to have a further discussion about this, and I think we discussed maybe the medical advisory board, just the whole concept of youth surveys. I know Dr. Paterno and Burley, you couldn't be at the last one, but we're willing to have that on a future agenda to be able to talk about when we do things like this, how do they fit into our curriculum, how do they fit into the structure, what is the benefit of them, what are they for, how do we report it to people, to the board members, how do we get parents to opt out, what's the purpose, how does it fit in with the whole SEL framework of our district. So I think it's a valid question, and we looked at, and so I appreciate you bringing it to our attention because we had to look at, what we did, and I think it'll be a good conversation to have. So it might be valuable information, but we do need to look at it, and I guess that's all I'll add. And I think the Illinois Youth Survey is every other year.
Yes, it is.
So I'm not sure, there might be some other type of report, Mr. Heidi, that we
I know that we once upon a time did get data.
Right.
Maybe it was every other year we got the data rather than every year. But
We'll find out.
Yeah, if you look back, I'm sure you will see at least some reports. I have half a mind that maybe once or twice it was combined with some other, with more academic data. But I'm pretty sure that if you go back far enough, you'll see at least that some separate memos that were presented to the board.
Yes, and there's some educational ends that focus on the SEL structure that we probably want to look at in conjunction. So I think it's worthy of discussion. We appreciate it being brought up.
And Jim, am I correct in saying that the data that is received from this survey, again, assuming that you get the data, are the findings therefore utilized in developing or enhancing various programs and or curriculum?
Probably not within our district curriculum. I think what we have always viewed that as is that all of the outside agencies that provide services, they want to get a feel for what youth are reporting so that they can develop services and focus those services. So if the responses come back and they're up significantly in 1 year about some particular aspect, they can focus their energies upon that. But I think if there's these data out there that we're just providing for somebody else and we're not looking at it, I think that's probably a loss, and we need to look at it and see how it fits in with our whole framework.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
So I think we can take this as a learning situation, and just don't do something for doing it. And Dr. Hinton and I think the team would all concur with that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Any questions?
I appreciate your words, Jim and Dr. Bender, about, looking thoughtfully at this. I mean, my concerns, there were several of them. The survey itself, I see some value in. In fact, when I talked to Mrs. Paterno about it, she scolded me for getting too hard on the researchers because she's a researcher. And it is a valuable method, I think, the survey. They're fairly valid and reliable. My problems with it were, number one, as you've already addressed, and I believe that you will continue to address it, is the right of the parents to have more intimate awareness of what's going on so that they can make a conscious decision whether they want their child to participate. That's just a constant theme you're going to hear from me over and over again. Secondly is when it's given, not just the time of year, which I appreciate, but also during class time, I believe it was given. And I wonder if there's a wiser other opportunity for it to be given at another time. Third is a child of 6th grade or 8th grade being able to give consent on a computer screen with a lot of jargon that they probably can't understand. I don't see how they can really give fully informed consent to do a survey like that, which goes back to my first point about the parents really being in charge of that decision. And then, knowing that at least the data are supposed to be private, but an outside source, if an occasion such as reporting abuse or something like that, it's really not that private. The data are connected to the child. And so an outside agency could look at it. I think parents need to know that. That's really important.
That seems to me to be, HIPAA and everything else.
Yes.
That seems to be a fairly substantial issue that I think the district probably does need to look at. This does, because substance abuse is a HIPAA-covered disease, it does seem to fall under HIPAA regulation, so which would not allow it to be tied to those data to be tied to any individual.
Shouldn't be tracked.
I do not know that that's the case, that you could tie it back to an individual student. That was not my understanding, but it's worth.
But Dr. Bender just mentioned.
Example was just
I don't know how
given.
it was traced back, I don't know the details.
That makes me less confident that the data are really
Confidential.
Secure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So I'd want to know more.
that's certainly something to look at, so we can do that.
Yep.
And then just last, the overall thing is more better communication. I appreciate, you saying that we should have done more of a letter and just really figuring out how we can best communicate with the parents. Is it email? Is it letters? Is it phone calls? Is it, opting in versus opting out? I mean, I feel pretty strongly that if you opt into something, you've got to know what's going on. You're not going to sign something unless you really looked at it. Versus not signing something is really just implicit permission. I don't think that's good enough. So I look forward to kind of brainstorming about that, whether it's on the medical advisory committee or in more board meetings.
Yeah. Well, not only the Illinois Youth Survey needs to be looked at, but some other programs that occur. Again, I recently had some folks contact me regarding a program that was conducted at Lincoln School. Just to give you some background on this. 1995, a grassroots effort was put out on a state-by-state basis, not federally organized, it was an anti-bullying program, ostensibly, to foster the knowledge of bullying against the LGBT community. And it was fostered as a day of silence, and it's a national day of silence, which on the surface seems pretty reasonable. But at Lincoln School, 4 students approached the principal and wanted to have a day of silence, and the principal said yes. Again, no letters were sent home, no notification of this was offered, and folks contacted me saying, if you didn't participate, does that mean that you're part of the bullying process? And how do you conduct education if all the students are silent? So several questions came up, and again, it goes back to notification. It goes back to parental knowledge and offering approval of their child to join in any programming. You've also been notified of these. I think I hit the salient points of this. But it seems to go back again. If this was a program that wanted to be done, advertise it. Tell people about it. We're going to be holding this program for this reason on such a day. And if you want to participate, you have the option. But again, no notification was given out.
So was this a program that then was sort of notified to the entire school, or was it, because I know there's a sort of club, if you have more than, what is it, 3 people, you can actually create a club. Was that more what this was, or was this a?
I don't think so. I think it was kind of, kind of spontaneous.
This was 4 students
Right.
that came to the principal and asked, can we do this? And
So it's
they
sort of
had-
along the same lines as his club, right? Doesn't Anthony have, is it?
It could be construed as that.
Yeah.
And it's their constitutional right to be able to
Sure.
bring this forward if they so wish to. And my guess is a lot of the ideas, they have brothers and sisters as a strong group at the high school. And my estimation is that that's probably where they got the idea, which I thought was a very good idea, actually. And I support Tony in what he did. I think there was misconsternation on the part of maybe some children at the school that they had to be a part of it, which my understanding from the principal is it was never, ever presented that way. It was simply presented as an option if anyone wanted to participate. Those 4 children said they were, and that's where that extent went.
Dr. Bender, may I add something? to
Sure.
that? I talked to Dr. Murray about it. The students did come to him, were interested in sharing their views on this point. And I think Dr. Murray's feelings about letting them share it with the school was actually to try to maintain the instructional integrity, because having the building know that there would be some students who wouldn't be talking would prevent teachers from saying, why are you not talking, etc. So I think the intent was to be least disruptive to the educational environment by just saying that some children are deciding to do this, and so we want you to be aware of it so that we don't have teachers saying, answer my question, and then not knowing what's going on. So it was a very innocent situation, and the idea, I believe, was to limit the instructional disruption during the day. It wasn't necessarily an endorsement. It was just, this is what these kids wanted to do, and we try to encourage kids at the middle school level to kind of be proactive in how they're feeling. So I think that was more the intent. And the way I understand Dr. Murray handled it, I was comfortable, not that that matters, but it was more done for instructional, for the building, as I explained.
Yeah, and that being the case, I think that's fine to modify the disruptive effect. But I got the impression, at least from the folks I spoke with, that it was more school-wide. It wasn't just for individuals. It was more open, more inclusive, and that's okay. It's just notification should be given and tell folks what's going on. And I think that's where email blasts come in, and I think there's any number of ways that people can be brought in on the secret, if you will, for the programming. So the programming itself and Tony's idea to minimize the disruption, I don't have a problem with. I just have a problem with the lack of notification to parents who have their children in that community. That's all.
I've just add I'm a little uncomfortable with the discussion here simply because I don't really feel I understand anything at all about this issue. I'm not really sure I need to understand anything about this issue because it sounds like an individual school, one incident related thing, and I'm not sure I have anything to contribute as a board member. So I don't need any more discussion on this. I guess the one thing I would say is please don't let my silence be construed as an opinion one way or another on whether Dr. Murray did or didn't do the right thing in this instance. I just don't know enough about it and don't really feel that it's my role at this point to weigh in on it.
I appreciate that, John, but the reason why I brought this to the board tonight and asked for this kind of discussion is because this board has had discussions amongst ourselves about communication, about tying in families into more about things that are going on in our district. There is some policy and procedure that is specific for establishing effective two-way communications. These are, in my opinion, two examples where that communication aspect can be enhanced. And sometimes I think we get away from some of the things that we have as our guiding principles. And I just wanted to make certain that folks in the administration remember that it is the families of our children that need to be educated as well, educated in basically what is happening. So that is why I brought it here. I am not whatsoever suggesting that I tell what administration what to do. I'm not. I'm more interested in following our policy of maintaining an open communication line with our families. That's what it is. So that being said, does anybody have any comments? And if not, I thank you for your indulgence, and we'll take a motion to conclude.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All agree?
Aye.
Aye.
Disagree? None? Thank you.